Florida, 1836. A time when the swamps were thicker than smoke and the night air carried the sound of things that should not have voices. Locals whispered about the Haraway family long before anyone met them. A quiet group who moved into the abandoned Renshaw estate, a place where no family had stayed longer than a season. The Haraways were respectable, God-fearing people, but they had one peculiar habit that turned every head in town. Every night, before locking their doors, they stood in a circle, held hands, and counted, one by one, each living soul in the house. Father, mother, 6 children, and sometimes one more. They said it was just a family ritual, something old, something harmless, but when the neighbors began hearing that extra voice in the count, low, breathy, and unmistakably wrong, they stopped visiting altogether. The Haraways said it was nothing, just the wind, maybe an echo off the swamp. But echoes don't answer when you call their names. And soon even the youngest began to whisper that the counting wasn't to keep track of the living. It was to keep the dead from forgetting who they were. The arrival of the Haraway family in 1836 was unlike the quiet settling of any ordinary newcomers. Their wagon rolled down the overgrown path toward the Renshaw plantation, its wheels creaking under the weight of furniture, trunks, and the heavy silence that seemed to follow them from town. The land they purchased was cheap, too cheap for what it offered. Acres of untouched cypress forest, a weathered 2-story manor with wraparound porches, and a reputation that made locals cross themselves when they spoke of it. The Haraways didn't believe in curses or ghosts. They believed in rebuilding. Thomas Haraway, the father, was a man who had lost everything in Georgia, his crops, his savings, and nearly his pride. Florida was supposed to be a new start, a place where the soil was richer, the air cleaner, and the memories easier to bury. But as the family's wagon neared the property, the atmosphere shifted. The sunlight dimmed under a canopy of moss-laden trees, and the sound of frogs and cicadas grew unnervingly synchronized, like nature itself was warning them to turn back. When the house came into view, it stood like a monument to something forgotten. The shutters hung unevenly, the paint was stripped by decades of storms, and the front door leaned open as if the house had been waiting for them. The children were uneasy, clinging to their mother's skirts as Thomas stepped onto the porch. Each plank groaned, and from inside came the faint thud of something falling, perhaps a shutter, perhaps something else. But Thomas pressed on, driven by a man's desperation to claim what was his. He declared the house sound enough to live in, despite the stench of mold and the distant scurrying in the walls. They began to unload their belongings as twilight bled into the horizon, painting the swamp in bruised colors. The first night brought a kind of stillness that only remote places know. No wagons, no voices, no movement, only the drone of insects and the occasional splash from the bog beyond the tree line. The Haraways lit candles in every room, pushing back the dark, and tried to ignore the feeling that the house was breathing with them. Mary Haraway, the mother, swore she saw movement in the upstairs window when they arrived, a shadow ducking out of sight, but she said nothing. She knew her husband's nerves were frayed and didn't want to start their new life with superstition. The children, though, whispered among themselves about shapes in the trees and faces that didn't seem to belong. By morning, the house seemed less menacing under the sunlight, almost inviting. They began cleaning, sweeping out leaves, and burning what was too decayed to save. Yet in the back rooms under the layers of dust they found small things left behind. A wooden doll missing its head, a cracked mirror propped against the wall, and faint etchings on the door frames, tally marks scratched deep into the wood as if someone had been counting the days or something else entirely. Thomas dismissed it as nonsense from the previous owners, but Mary couldn't shake the feeling that those marks weren't just records. They were warnings. That night, when they gathered for dinner, the youngest child, Eliza, asked why they hadn't counted yet. The parents froze, confused, but Eliza giggled and said the house had told her they needed to. Thomas brushed it off as a child's imagination, but when they went to bed, Mary whispered that perhaps they should, just for peace of mind. So they did. Each stood in a line by the stairs, counting aloud, one by one. 8 voices in harmony, steady and calm, until the final number echoed a bit too long, as if someone else had joined in. They glanced around, uneasy, but saw only their own reflections in the candlelight. It was the first time they performed the ritual that would soon define them, the act that began as a game and ended as their undoing. The counting ritual began as something harmless, even comforting, a nightly reminder that the family was together and safe. It started the second evening after their arrival, when the youngest, Eliza, insisted again that they must make sure everyone's still here. Her voice was small but certain, and though her words carried the tone of a child's play, something about them unsettled her parents. Mary Haraway laughed nervously and agreed, saying it could be their way of blessing the house. So, as dusk swallowed the last light over the swamp, they gathered by the stairwell, each holding a candle that trembled with every breath of air. Thomas stood at the front and began to count, his voice steady, low, and deliberate. One by one, they called out their names, the echoes bouncing off the wooden walls, until the number 8 drifted into silence. For a brief moment afterward, none of them moved or spoke. It was as if the house itself was listening, waiting to see if it had been included. Then Thomas laughed, the tension broke, and everyone went to bed. But the ritual did not end there. The next night, Eliza reminded them again. This time, there was no laughter. The air felt heavier, the candles burned lower, and the shadows in the corners stretched longer than they should have. They stood in the same spot, forming a circle as if protecting one another, their voices overlapping as they counted aloud. Each count sounded more deliberate than the last, and when they reached 8, Thomas hesitated, feeling something almost imperceptible, a faint draft across his neck, a whisper behind him, too soft to make sense of. He turned, but there was only darkness. Still, he said nothing, not wanting to admit that something about the counting felt necessary now, as if skipping it would offend the house itself. Within days, the counting became a rule, an unspoken duty performed each night before anyone could sleep. If one of the children was too tired or forgot, Mary would insist they all start over. It was no longer about comfort. It was about control, about making sure the walls didn't swallow someone in the dark. Even the children stopped questioning it, stopped. They lined up automatically after dinner, hands clasped, eyes darting toward the staircase where the shadows pooled deepest. The longer they lived there, the stronger the sense that they weren't the only ones inside grew. Small sounds became familiar, the soft creak of a step when no one was moving, the subtle closing of a door left ajar, the faint sound of humming beneath the floorboards. At first, they tried to rationalize it. The house was old, the wood expanding and settling. But when Eliza began asking if they should count the quiet boy too, everything changed. Mary's face drained of color, and Thomas forbade her from mentioning it again. Yet when they counted that night, the rhythm faltered. Between 7 and 8, there was a pause. Someone, or something, seemed to whisper the final number before Thomas could speak it. The family froze, their candle flames flickering violently for a moment before settling back into stillness. No one admitted to hearing the voice, but each of them did. They went to bed pretending nothing had happened, but the next morning, Mary found one of the dining chairs pulled out slightly from the table, as if someone had been sitting there during the night. The ritual deepened into obsession. It became the family's way of maintaining order, their fragile grip on what they could still name and count. They began to do it not just before sleep, but also during storms, after arguments, and once, even in the middle of the day, when Mary swore she heard breathing upstairs. Each time they reached the final number, a moment of relief came, followed by the same creeping uncertainty. Were they counting to protect themselves, or to acknowledge something that had already joined them? The Haraways never spoke the question aloud, but each night as their voices echoed through the hallways, they could feel another presence keeping count too, quiet and patient, waiting for the moment they'd forget to stop at 8. It was on the 12th night that the Haraways first counted the wrong number. The evening had fallen heavy and humid, the air pressing against the windows like a living thing. The swamp outside hissed with frogs and unseen creatures, and thunder murmured somewhere far beyond the trees. The family gathered, as they always did, at the base of the stairs with their candles trembling in the damp air. The ritual had grown quieter with each passing night, less of a family moment and more of a grim duty. They no longer spoke much before it began. Thomas would clear his throat, glance at each of the children, and begin the slow, rhythmic count that had become their unspoken law. One by one, the voices followed. But that night, something changed in the rhythm, something small but deeply wrong. When the final number left their lips, there were 9 voices instead of 8. No one said it at first. They stood frozen, the silence after the count heavier than any storm. The candles flickered violently, as if reacting to a gust that had no source. Thomas's eyes darted across the faces of his family, his mind struggling to match the sound he had just heard with the mouths before him. Mary clutched Eliza's shoulder, her hand shaking so hard that the candle wax dripped onto her wrist. It wasn't a child's giggle, nor an echo. It had been a distinct, breathy voice joining theirs at the end, whispering the number 9. Thomas tried to dismiss it as a trick of the house. "The wind," he said too quickly, forcing a laugh that cracked halfway through. But even as he spoke, his voice trembled. The children looked at each other with wide, wet eyes. They had all heard it. The voice hadn't come from any of them, and it hadn't come from the stairs or the walls. It had come from right there, within their circle. They tried to shake it off, to end the night in forced normalcy, but no one slept. Mary sat upright in bed, listening to the boards creak in the hallway outside their room. She thought of the empty spaces in their count, the places where someone could have easily stood unseen but near enough to be heard. When she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, she dreamed of the family standing again by the stairs. Only this time she couldn't tell which of them was wrong, which face didn't belong. In the morning the house felt changed. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, like the ground had been disturbed somewhere nearby. Thomas found muddy footprints near the back door, too small to be his own but too large to belong to Eliza. He wiped them clean without telling anyone. When the sun set again, no one had the courage to mention the ritual, yet they all gathered anyway. It was as if the act had its own gravity now, something pulling them to repeat it no matter their fear. The count began again, voices low, cautious. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm held steady, but when they reached 8, they stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Thomas didn't dare finish the count, terrified the voice would return. And yet, faintly, from somewhere deep in the house, came the whisper of the final number, drawn out and soft, almost mocking. The children screamed and the candles went out in unison. Thomas searched the house that night from attic to cellar, every room, every corner, calling out for whoever, or whatever, was playing this cruel trick. But there was no one, only the echo of his own footsteps and, once, the faint sound of counting, slow and patient, drifting from the direction of the nursery. From that night on, the Haraways never counted without fear. They tried to convince themselves it had been imagination, a shared dream born of isolation and exhaustion. But deep down they knew. The house had learned their ritual, and it wanted to be part of it. Each night they counted. It was waiting, listening for the moment to add itself once more. Eliza Haraway was the first to speak to him, the one she called the pale boy. She began mentioning him only a few days after the night of the extra count, her voice casual and innocent, as if describing a new playmate. At first, Mary and Thomas assumed she was inventing stories to distract herself from the growing tension in the house. Children often created imaginary friends, especially in places where real company was scarce. But what unsettled Mary wasn't the imagination behind the name, it was the way Eliza described him. She said the pale boy didn't have color in his eyes, only light, like candle wax melting through glass. He never smiled, never blinked, and only appeared after the counting was done. He didn't talk much, but when he did, he asked the same question every time. "Did you count me tonight?" At first, the parents laughed it off. They told her the boy was just a dream, something her mind had made up from the old ghost tales her siblings whispered at night. Yet Eliza insisted that he wasn't a dream because she could feel the cold in the air when he was near. She said he liked to stand in the hallway where the moonlight touched the floorboards, and if she closed her eyes, she could hear him counting along in a whisper that never matched their rhythm. The other children grew frightened and refused to sleep in the same room with her. They said they had seen the shape of someone standing outside their door, too tall to be Eliza, too still to be alive. Mary began noticing small, unnerving changes in the house. Toys would be moved from where they had been left, and Eliza's wooden doll kept appearing on the top step of the staircase every morning, always facing the family's bedroom. Once, when Mary tried to throw the doll away, she found it back in Eliza's bed by evening. The family's nights became restless. Thomas, who had once scoffed at the idea of superstition, now started the counting earlier each evening, as though finishing before darkness fully fell would somehow keep whatever lurked in the shadows at bay. But the more they counted, the stronger the presence felt. Eliza grew pale and quiet. She stopped playing with her siblings and instead sat for hours in the hallway, whispering to the air. When Mary asked her what she was saying, Eliza would smile faintly and reply that she was teaching the pale boy how to count properly. The next night, during their ritual, when Thomas called the numbers aloud, a soft voice echoed the same ones from upstairs, perfectly synchronized. Every person in that house froze. Thomas's candle trembled in his grip as his voice broke mid-count. He demanded that whoever was there come out, shouting up the stairs, but no one answered. Only silence followed, thick and waiting. From that night on, Eliza stopped sleeping in her own bed. Mary often woke to find her daughter standing at the window, staring toward the woods, her lips moving as though answering someone outside. When asked what she saw, Eliza would only say, "He doesn't like being left out." The family began dreading the ritual they once found comforting, yet they couldn't stop. Something in them felt compelled to continue, as though breaking the tradition would anger the boy further. The pale boy's presence started to leave its mark. Cold spots appeared in the hallways where no draft could reach, and in the mornings, the mirrors fogged from the inside out. Once, Thomas caught his reflection lagging a moment behind his movements, as if something else was standing just behind him, mimicking his gestures. Eliza grew sicker, her voice softer, her eyes hollow. She claimed the boy told her things about the house, about the ones who lived there before, and how they too had forgotten who was real and who was counted. Thomas and Mary stopped arguing about what was real. By then, they both knew the truth but could not face it. Something had joined their circle. It was no longer a game, and Eliza was no longer the only one who saw him. The first time Mary Haraway noticed the empty chair, she thought little of it. It was a warm night, thick with the smell of rain and swamp lilies, and the family had just finished their evening meal. Everyone had left the dining table, eager to escape the stifling air and the unspoken tension that had grown between them since Eliza began speaking of her pale companion. As Mary cleared the dishes, her eyes caught on a single chair left slightly pulled out from the table, its legs angled as though someone had just risen from it. At first she assumed one of the children had been careless, but as she stepped closer, her breath caught. There, beneath the chair, was a small patch of damp earth smeared across the wooden floorboards, dark, wet, and fresh, as if someone had tracked in mud moments before. The door had been locked since sunset. She wiped the floor clean and told herself it was nothing, a remnant from the children playing earlier. But the next morning, the chair was pulled out again. This time, no one had entered the room since the night before, and there was no sign of muddy shoes, only a faint, lingering scent of wet soil and a chill that clung to the edges of the room. When she asked Thomas if he had noticed it, his expression hardened. He said the house was old. Perhaps the floorboards had shifted. He told her to stop feeding the children's fears with talk of strange happenings. Yet when they sat down for supper that evening, Mary noticed his eyes dart to that same chair before he began to eat. Over the following days, the chair's position became impossible to ignore. Every morning it was found slightly moved, as though someone had sat there quietly in the dark hours. On some nights, the family swore they heard the creak of wood during their counting ritual, a faint sound of pressure on a seat. Eliza said it was the pale boy's place. "He didn't like being forgotten," she whispered, smiling faintly, her face pale in the candlelight. Thomas slammed his hand on the table, demanding she stop speaking nonsense, but the anger in his voice couldn't hide the tremor underneath. By the third week, the empty chair was no longer just a nuisance. It became a presence. Whenever they gathered to eat, no one dared to sit in it. The space remained untouched, as if silently reserved. At times, Thomas tried to move it into another room, but each time he did, it would return overnight to its usual place. Once, in a fit of frustration, he dragged it outside to the porch and left it there before locking every door and window. But by dawn, it was back at the table, facing his seat. He refused to speak of it again after that. The children began to whisper about hearing someone breathe near the table when no one else was there. Mary tried to comfort them, though she herself had begun to feel it too, a coldness that gathered beside her whenever the candles flickered low. The house, once filled with noise and laughter, fell into uneasy quiet during meals. No one spoke above a whisper, and the sound of utensils against plates seemed unnaturally loud. Then came the night when Thomas sat down to eat and realized the chair was already pulled out. He pushed it back against the table, forcing a small laugh that sounded hollow, but when he turned away, it creaked back into its former position, as though unseen hands had claimed it again. His face drained of color. That same night, during the counting ritual, Mary could swear she heard an extra breath after the final number, like a sigh of contentment from somewhere near the dining room. Soon, they stopped pretending the chair was an accident. It became part of their routine, unspoken but accepted. They would count, eat, and leave one seat open, always the same one. Sometimes, after the candles were blown out, the sound of a chair leg scraping faintly against the floor would echo through the silent house. And in those moments, none of them moved. None of them spoke. For in the house of the Haraways, it had become clear that one of the family's places no longer belonged to the living. It was Thomas who found the journal, though he would later wish he had never touched it. The night had been restless, thick with thunder and the distant roar of rain sliding off the roof like whispers. Sleep had become almost impossible in the Haraway house. Every door creaked as if moved by unseen fingers, and every gust of wind carried with it faint murmurs that seemed to come from within the walls. So when he rose from bed and took the candle into the attic, he did it not out of courage, but out of a desperate need to prove that the noises had an earthly cause. The attic was suffocating, layered with dust and cobwebs that clung to his clothes as he moved. The smell of old wood and decay filled the air, and the candle's flame shivered with each step. He found nothing unusual at first, just rotting furniture, cracked trunks, and relics of lives long abandoned. But in the farthest corner, beneath a pile of rotted quilts, he uncovered something wrapped in brittle cloth. Inside was a small leather-bound book, its cover warped by moisture, and its pages yellowed, the ink faded but still legible in the candlelight. The name scratched into the first page stopped his breath cold, property of Elias Renshaw. The Renshaws were the family who had owned the estate before them, the ones the locals refused to speak of except in hushed, half-remembered rumors. Thomas turned the pages carefully, reading by the trembling glow. The entries began innocently enough, descriptions of farm life, the weather, and the isolation of the swamps. But as he read on, the tone darkened. The writer spoke of strange occurrences, the sound of counting at night, voices reciting numbers where no one stood, and the appearance of small footprints leading nowhere. He wrote of his children talking to a boy who wasn't there and of finding chairs moved from their place each morning. Every detail mirrored what the Haraways themselves had been enduring, as if the past was playing itself out again, line for line. The last entries grew frantic, scrawled in uneven handwriting, sentences unfinished and stained with what looked like tears or blood. One line repeated again and again in the final pages. "We count so they don't forget us. We count so they remember who's gone." Thomas's hand trembled as he turned the final page. The last entry was dated 40 years earlier, ending abruptly with the words, "He stood beside me tonight. He whispered my name before I could say the last number." The ink beneath those words was smeared, the page torn slightly as if the pen had been ripped away mid-sentence. Thomas felt a cold sweat slide down his neck. The candle flickered violently, and for a brief second he thought he heard the faintest sound of a whisper behind him, something counting under its breath. He turned quickly, the beam of his candle slicing through dust and darkness, but nothing was there. Yet he could not shake the sense that the attic had shifted around him, that the air itself had drawn closer. When he came downstairs, Mary saw his face and knew at once that he had found something he shouldn't have. He handed her the journal with trembling hands and refused to speak of it for hours. When she finally read it, her lips quivered, and she closed it halfway through, unwilling to see how it ended. The children asked what was wrong, but neither parent answered. That night, they performed the counting ritual with shaking voices, each number spoken slower than the last, every eye darting toward the attic door as if waiting for it to open. From then on, the journal remained locked in a drawer, but its presence weighed on the house like a curse. Sometimes, in the dead of night, Thomas swore he heard the faint rustle of pages turning upstairs, though no one had touched it. Once he found it lying open on the dining table, turned to the page where Elias Renshaw had written about the extra voice in his family's count. The same faint smudge of dirt that had appeared beneath the empty chair now streaked across the paper. It was then Thomas realized the truth he had been avoiding. The Haraways had not inherited a home. They had inherited a ritual, one that began long before them, and one that demanded to be repeated. The storm that night seemed to crawl out of the swamp itself, black clouds rolling low and fast over the Haraway plantation, as if the sky had grown heavy with secrets. The rain came in violent sheets, drumming against the roof and windows like desperate hands, while lightning flashed through the trees, illuminating their skeletal outlines. Inside, the family huddled together in the parlor, the air thick with fear and the damp scent of mildew. Every corner of the house seemed alive, whispering and shifting, the walls moaning with each gust of wind. They had counted earlier than usual, hoping to finish before the storm grew worse, but even as they reached the final number, the thunder seemed to mimic their voices, echoing the count back to them. The candle flames fluttered wildly, and one went out, leaving a streak of smoke that twisted toward the ceiling. Thomas muttered a prayer under his breath. He was trying to be strong, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He was terrified of his own home. As the night deepened, the wind forced the shutters open, and the rain blew in through the cracks, turning the wood floors slick and cold. Mary gathered the children close, counting them again, softly this time, not as part of the ritual but from raw instinct. She whispered their names: Eliza, Samuel, Jonah, Ruth, Isaac, Margaret, and the number settled at 6. But when she turned to Thomas, he wasn't looking at her. He was staring toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms, where a faint sound had just echoed through the noise of the storm, a single distant footstep. He told everyone to stay where they were and took the lantern. The flame wavered as he climbed the stairs, calling out each child's name, but only silence answered him. The house felt heavier now, as though filled with water and breathing slowly around him. When he reached the top of the stairs, he saw that Eliza's door was open. The room inside was empty. Her small bed was perfectly made, her doll resting neatly on the pillow. But the window was wide open, the curtains soaked and flapping wildly in the wind. Thomas shouted her name, leaning into the storm, his voice lost in the roar. There was no sign of her outside, no footprints, no sound, nothing but the endless blackness of rain. He searched the entire house, every room, every corner, until the walls themselves seemed to close in around him. When he returned to the parlor, drenched and shaking, Mary knew before he spoke. The children began to cry, clinging to her as lightning illuminated the room again. But then, from somewhere upstairs, came a soft, unmistakable sound, counting, slow and steady, each number drawn out like a lullaby. 1, 2, 3. It was Eliza's voice, clear as day, calling down to them through the storm. Mary's scream tore through the air as Thomas ran back toward the stairs, shouting for her to stop. But the voice kept going, louder now, overlapping itself until it no longer sounded like a child. The numbers blended into whispers that filled every corner of the house. When the storm finally broke, The silence that followed was worse than the noise. The family stood trembling, soaked and hollow-eyed. Thomas gathered them once more for the ritual, desperate for something to hold on to, something to prove that they were still whole. They began the count with shaking voices, calling out each name, each number, clinging to the sound as if it were life itself. When they reached 8, they stopped. The room went still. For a moment it seemed everything was right again. Then Mary's voice cracked as she realized what they had just said. 8. There were only 7 of them standing there now. No one dared speak. The number was correct, but the faces were wrong. It was as if the count had replaced what they had lost, as though the ritual itself refused to allow a missing piece. Thomas looked around at his family, each face pale and terrified, and for the first time, he couldn't be sure if everyone in front of him was truly alive. The storm had passed, but in its wake, something had shifted permanently inside the Haraway home. The count would never be right again, yet it would always reach the same number. The night the Carter family finally decided to leave the house, the air outside felt no safer than the suffocating rooms within. Their lanterns barely pierced the darkness as they packed whatever they could carry: clothes, a few keepsakes, and the heavy family Bible that had sat on the mantel for generations. But even as the carriage wheels cracked over the gravel, each of them could sense eyes watching from behind the windows of the old house. The youngest, Mary, whispered that she saw someone standing in the nursery window, the same room where the cradle had once rocked by itself. Her mother told her not to look back, but Mary's trembling voice carried through the night, insisting that the figure in the window was waving goodbye. As the carriage rolled further from the property, the sound of the wind changed. It wasn't the normal whistle of the forest. It was a chorus of faint murmurs, almost counting one after another, as though unseen voices were keeping tally. 1, 2, 3. The same ghostly counting that had haunted the family for years. When they reached the edge of the property, Thomas Carter, the father, turned back one final time. The outline of their home was faint against the moonlight, but what made his blood freeze was the sight of faint silhouettes standing in every window. Dozens of them. They weren't shapes of people they knew, nor strangers, but something in between, like memories too stubborn to fade. Their faces were blurred, but the movement of their lips was unmistakable. They were whispering, counting, and smiling. The family drove through the night without stopping, but by dawn, the sense of being followed refused to fade. The youngest boy claimed he heard whispers from beneath the floorboards of the carriage, while his sister said she saw pale faces in the reflection of the carriage glass. No one spoke of it again, but deep down, every member of the Carter family knew they hadn't left alone. Something had followed them. Years later, the house stood empty, swallowed by overgrown vines and Spanish moss. Locals called it cursed. Hunters, travelers, and drifters who passed near the property swore they heard faint counting from within the walls at night. Some claimed to see flickering candlelight through the shattered windows, while others saw shadows moving from room to room as if the family still lived there. Eventually, even the land around the estate grew silent. No birds sang, no insects chirped, and even the wind refused to touch the house. It stood as a monument to something unspoken, something unfinished, a ledger of souls, perhaps, still keeping track. Decades later, a team of historians visited the ruins in hopes of understanding the Carter family's strange legacy. They discovered something chilling buried beneath the floorboards, small stones arranged in a perfect circle, each etched with numbers going far beyond the size of the family that once lived there. But what disturbed them most was that some of the stones were newly carved, their surfaces clean and unweathered, as if someone, or something, had been keeping the count alive. By nightfall, one of the historians disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only his notebook with the last entry scrawled in trembling handwriting. They never stopped counting, and now they've added me. To this day, no one has dared to rebuild on that land. Locals still hear faint counting carried by the wind, and some say that if you listen closely enough, the voices grow louder the closer you step toward the ruins. It's said the spirits of the Carters, and the countless others they unknowingly invited, still linger, trapped between this world and the next, doomed to tally souls until the final number is reached. And if you ever find yourself walking near those woods at night and you hear someone softly counting just behind you, don't turn around, because if you do, they'll start counting you too. So if this story sent chills down your spine, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.